Hello everyone, thank you very much. My name is Maggie Simpson. I'm the Director General of the Rail Freight Group, and we are a trade association who represent businesses right across the rail freight sector. We have over 100 members, that's everyone from freight train operators, end customers, ports, terminals, supply chain and support services. And as a body, we campaign to increase the volume of goods that are moved by rail within the UK. And it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you today about freight decarbonisation and about how the public and private sector can work together most effectively to help achieve freight decarbonisation, particularly in our cities and our urban centres. Now, through my role, I go out and speak to a lot of policymakers and indeed industry, and freight decarbonisation is a topic that comes up time and time again. And the kind of topics that are often spoken about in the context of freight decarbonisation include some of the things that you can see on this slide. That's delivery robots, e-cargo bikes, hydrogen, and the kind of tube systems that some people think could work underneath our cities. And whilst it's not for me to say that there isn't a space for these interventions at some point in freight decarbonisation, in the context of rail freight and the areas that my members are looking at, it's hard to see that these can really be the key to freight decarbonisation. So whilst it's important that we work together to try and understand how and where measures such as these might have a place, we need to look more widely across the brief at how we can look at carbonisation of the entire freight supply chain, as well as those parts that work in urban centres. When I'm talking to people, we also, I'm afraid, see a lot of this, that we will in time achieve net zero and the decarbonisation of the freight sector by reliance on things that simply haven't been invented yet, or indeed things which might have been invented but where the rate of R&D development is so low that we won't get to 2050 before they're exploitable in commercial operation. And this is a particular challenge for heavy industries such as freight transport, where some of the technologies are indeed in their infancy and where it's yet unproven as to whether we can get the power output and the demands that we need. And again, R&D will move on. We understand that the rate of development of some technologies is rapid, and the deployment could also be rapid in due course and with the right framework. But when I speak to policymakers today, frankly, there's often too much reliance on the hope that something will change in the future, and not, frankly, enough reliance on looking at the solutions which can exist today. So I like to focus increasingly on how we can work today to make less carbon through freight transport in what we do today. 2050 may only be 29 years away, and 2040, by when we have to have no diesel-only trains on the network, is only 19 years away. But in those 29 or 19 years, we could, if we don't do anything, emit an awful lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we have to have a real focus, I believe, not just on those long-term strategies, but what we can do today to reduce the emissions that we make. And here are some of the areas that we're focusing on as in pursuit of that. First of all, modal shift to rail and water. And I know that is often overplayed in some respects, but there are parts of the trunk haul network in our country where modal shift onto rail and onto water could work now today to significantly reduce the carbon emissions that freight transport emits. We know that on average a freight train emits something like 76% less carbon dioxide than using the equivalent journey by HGV. And whilst obviously the exact amount of carbon saving varies by route, we also know that where we can run our trains more heavily loaded and longer, we're making even more carbon savings per unit than we would be using road net freight, or indeed by using shorter and less efficient trains. The modal shift to rail, where it's appropriate and sensible to do that, particularly on the trunk haul, is a key element of making less carbon today. But it isn't the only one. We also need to look at how we plan our infrastructure networks better. There's a lot of discussion and debate about how infrastructure networks should be expanded, whether that's rail or road or other infrastructure such as digital broadband and so on. But actually, if we use the networks that we've got better whilst we discuss how best to upgrade them, then we could reduce less carbon. We know, for example, that a freight train that gets put into a loop to allow passenger train to pass will produce something like 10 or 14% more carbon emissions than one that can run straight through. And we know that the longer trains, if we run them, are exponentially better in terms of the carbon saving for those last loads on the train. And this isn't unique to rail. I hear the same story from my colleagues in road freight, who are concerned about their inability to operate in peak hours and indeed in some cases overnight, which forces traffic into already congested parts of the daytime, meaning that they're more congested traffic, more congested roads and using more carbon. And colleagues in air freight tell me about the need for airspace modernisation, where more direct routes into airports could save significant carbon as part of their journey to net zero. So looking at technology and looking at how we can plan our networks better can be an important part of making less carbon today, even before we look at the investment that's needed in those networks. We also need to look at new products and services, things that we can do differently to help share the load, if you like, and move more goods onto rail and indeed water freight. The picture you've seen there is of a converted passenger multiple unit that we expect to see in live service later this year. It's being developed by Rail Operations Group and being targeted at the parcels market for high-speed logistics up and down the networks in this country, where road freight or indeed air freight is currently the principal mode of operation. And they aren't the only business looking at this kind of product. There are other people trying to do similar and get services up and running. It's a market that's in its infancy, but one where we can see real potential on particularly the trunk haul to remove road vehicles or indeed possibly domestic flight from the freight transport mix. And finally, and this one is perhaps a little more controversial, but we need to look at where and how and if low carbon fuels, if they can be sustainably sourced, could be part of what we do today. We know that there are some significant questions around the sustainability and the long-term viability of biofuels, and we know that government thinks that biofuels should be saved for the airline and possibly the maritime industries by 2050. But right now today, if they are sustainably sourced using synthetic or other fuels away from diesel as part or all of the fuel that we use on those journeys, can make a significant reduction in carbon in sectors which are hard to decarbonise otherwise. So I have members who are looking at HVO as a short-term measure to reduce carbon emissions, and they're making inquiries and looking into that with a lot of energy at the moment to make sure that they can use it effectively in the equipment that they have, and indeed that its own sustainability is properly assured as part of that. But we have to look at what we can do with that, both now in the short term and in the long term, to try and reduce the amount of carbon that we make. But of course, that isn't the only part. The target to reach net zero doesn't go away. So as well as working on how we can reduce carbon emissions today, we do, of course, also have to think about the longer term. And where we've been working and doing the research in rail freight brings us to a position with 5 key elements. Firstly, modal shift to rail, as I've said, is a key part of today, and not just today, but also in the coming decades, to help reduce freight emissions overall. We also today need to increase the amount that we can do by electric haulage today. Today, around about 12% of rail freight is hauled electrically. There are some electric locos, not so many in the mix, but enough to do some more. And we need to be trying to use them wherever we run under electric wires that exist. There are some challenges in doing that. There isn't always enough power supplied to the electrified network. And there are some very small sections of the route which, if they were the electric wires were extended, we could do more. We call those infill electrification, and we're pushing with governments to try and get some progress on those. But actually, we know that the rail network will in time need to be electrified, at least for the trunk haul routes, if we are to sustainably switch across to use more electric haulage in the long term. So there's active discussion with other stakeholders about how we can promote that investment in the rail network. And that's so important because we know that we need to make significant investment in new locomotives. Those new locomotives need to be probably electric bi-mode, and they need to be on the ground very quickly if we're to meet the government's targets of no diesel-only trains by 2040. So having confidence that the rail network will have more electrification than it has today is a key part of making the case for investing in those new locomotives. And finally, we need to look at how terminals, ports and other areas where our freight trains go into are themselves decarbonised. And there's some work beginning to look at the options for that around how we might move the trains through the terminal, how the handling equipment could be decarbonised, and what the associated requirements on site would be. And finally, how is this working between the public sector, so in our case, Network Rail, government, but across the freight, other government agencies, local government, between the city regions who often set urban policy, increasingly actively so in fact, around freight, and across the private sector where my members mostly operate and where they're looking to make the right investments to decarbonise their businesses. For me, there are some clear things that sit in different camps. It would be quite reasonable to expect the private sector to make the investment in equipment and facilities. That's new locomotives, that's wagons, that's decarbonised terminals, that's on-site fuelling. It would also be reasonable to expect those businesses to manage the necessary business change, to put their time and energy, if not their money, into supporting research and development, to look at the development of new products and services supporting modal shift, and to look at the kind of data and information requirements that decarbonisation also brings. But they can't do that without support. We need a piece of public policy support to help those investments, those business changes happen. I think the thing we most need, the clearest thing we need, is a clear policy framework around how government, local government, city regions want to see freight decarbonised effectively. Because if we have that framework, then people can underpin the investments that they need to make in those new locomotives and those new terminals. We need to have national and local alignment of policy too. So because freight is a national network, things that happen in Scotland need to be mirrored in England so that we can plan our end-to-end journeys effectively. And that isn't just about the nations of the UK, it's about the interfaces between regions and cities. We need to have a coherent national framework to support the investments that are needed. We do need government to invest in the core network, whether that's Network Rail or Highways England, or whether that's in hydrogen fuelling, or whether that's in support for the energy sector to generate the green energy that we need to make those necessary transformations. If we have the confidence that those investments will be made, then the investment in the equipment to operate on those networks will come. And we also need government to help us with those capacity choices that help us to make better use of the network. If we're going to see structural change in the way that people are moved around the country, whether that's a structural change in demand for rail or in demand for road space, then there are choices that can be made about how that capacity is allocated to better support freight and to better support freight decarbonisation. And we need to be having these conversations now so that as we build back, we bake in that capacity and we bake in those frameworks that help us to support the decisions we've got to make in the next 19 or indeed 29 years. And finally, we need to have a framework that gives the right incentives and support to business on that journey and that supports them in making the right choices around the equipment that they buy and the way that they operate, and that gives the long-term certainty to them to work collaboratively with the public sector to deliver the decarbonisation that we know those networks need. In the railways, we're going through a period of reform with the government's white paper now published. So really the time is absolutely right for looking at how we can make a step change in rail freight, in modal shift and in the decarbonisation of freight transport with rail at its heart. Thank you very much for listening to me today and looking forward to taking your questions a little bit later on. Thank you very much.